This experience is being shared with urgency and without delay. We ask that you listen to it from beginning to end before drawing any conclusion. Take note of the dates. Take note of the details, and please let us know where you are watching from so we can continue to stand with you in prayer. The words below belong to Pastor Claxon Alfred. They have not been edited, softened, or revised. They are delivered exactly as he submitted them, in the fear of God and for the sake of those who still have ears to hear. My name is Claxon Alfred. I am 58 years old and I have been pastoring a small congregation in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania for the past 11 years. We are not famous. We do not stream our services. We do not have a merchandise table or a branding team or a social media manager. We meet in a converted warehouse on the east side of the city, and on most winter Sundays, the heating system works only when it feels like cooperating, which is not always. We are ordinary people. We are a praying people. And for the past 3 weeks, we have been a people shaken to the root of our faith by something that I can no longer keep inside the 4 walls of that warehouse. Before I became a pastor, I served in the United States Army as a chaplain, 2 deployments. One in Iraq during the surge years, when the violence was so dense and so constant, the death began to feel like weather, something you simply dressed for in the morning. The second deployment was in Afghanistan near the final years of the American mission there, when everyone with enough rank to read the intelligence reports knew that the mission had already failed. But the machinery of war kept moving because stopping it required a courage that the institution did not possess. I have prayed over men who were still breathing and did not survive the hour. I have held commanding officers while they wept in the dark because they had just sent young men to their deaths based on intelligence they privately doubted. I have sat in trauma with soldiers who came home carrying things they could never name to the people who loved them. I have been present in the worst moments that human beings can experience, and I have not broken. I tell you all of this not to recommend myself as anything extraordinary. I tell you this so that you understand the caliber of what I am about to describe. So that when I say this shook me more than anything I witnessed in either theater of war, you understand the weight of that statement. 3 weeks ago, after 16 days of fasting and prayer, I received a vision in my study at the church at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning. I was awake. My Bible was open on the desk in front of me. I had been seeking God about a heaviness that had settled over my congregation in recent months. A collective unease that no one could quite articulate but everyone could feel. It was like the air before a thunderstorm, that pressure change that your body registers before your mind has named it. Members of my congregation were making unusual decisions. A family that had lived in the same house for 20 years quietly sold it and moved out of state. A man who owned a small business told me he had been dissolving assets and converting them into things he could hold in his hands. A woman who works in state government told me privately that she had never, in 15 years of service, seen the volume of internal communications about emergency frameworks and contingency governance that she was seeing right now. And when I pressed her for details, she looked at me with a steadiness that was more frightening than alarm, and she said, "Pastor, they are not planning for emergencies. They are planning for a new normal." I did not sleep well after that conversation, and I prayed, and I fasted, and I waited for God to speak. On the 16th night, he did. I cannot give you the physics of what happened in that room. I cannot give you a clinical explanation for the change in atmosphere that preceded the vision, because there is no clinical explanation for it. If you have been filled with the Holy Spirit, if you have ever been in a room where the presence of God arrived in a way that was unmistakable, you will understand when I say that the air became different. Not colder, not warmer. Different in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The closest natural analogy I can offer is what it feels like when a flight drops suddenly in clear air, that reversal of gravity in your stomach. That brief moment when the normal order of things is suspended. It was like that. But it was not in my stomach. It was in my spirit. As if something of immense weight and authority had entered the room and the room itself acknowledged it. I did not fall. I did not shake. I have been in enough spiritually charged environments to know that the most intense experiences of God's presence are often the stillest ones. I sat in my chair. I placed both hands flat on the desk, and I listened with everything I had. What followed was not a dream, and it was not a hallucination, and it was not the product of an exhausted man's subconscious manufacturing meaning out of anxiety. I have spent 20 years learning the difference between the voice of God and the voice of my own fear, and I know what each one feels like. What unfolded before me both in my spirit and before my eyes simultaneously, in a way that defies neat categorization, was a vision in 3 movements. 3 acts of a single unfolding event, not 3 separate prophecies. 1 event, being revealed in stages, the way a landscape reveals itself as the fog lifts, first the nearest thing, then the middle ground, then the terrible horizon behind it all. I will tell you each movement in the order it was shown to me, and I ask you to resist the impulse to reach for a familiar framework, to file what I am saying into a category you have already prepared. What I saw does not fit neatly into the end times templates most of us were handed in Sunday school. It is both more immediate and more sophisticated than those templates suggested, and that is precisely why so many people are unprepared for it. The first thing I saw was governments. Not one government, not a single dramatic coup with tanks in the street and a dictator on a balcony. That is not how it is happening. What I saw was a process, quiet, methodical, legal in its appearance, bureaucratic in its texture. I saw legislation moving through democratic systems the way a slow-moving illness moves through a body, undramatically, without announcement, producing effects that are only understood in retrospect when the damage is already complete. I saw laws being rewritten, not by force, not at gunpoint, but by exhaustion, by the exhaustion of citizens who had been overwhelmed by the volume of information and had stopped being able to distinguish what mattered from what did not, by the exhaustion of watchmen, journalists, activists, clergy, concerned citizens who had raised alarms for so long without being heeded that they had eventually gone quiet, not because they were silenced, but because silence felt less costly than continued futility. I saw rooms with no cameras. I want you to understand what I mean when I say that, not metaphorically but literally. I saw rooms in which consequential decisions were being made about the structure of nations, about the architecture of power, about the future of ordinary people's daily lives. And there were no cameras in those rooms, no journalists, no oversight, no accountability. I saw documents being signed. I saw handshakes across tables. I saw the language of law being used as a scalpel rather than a shield, cutting away the protections that people believed were permanent because no one had explained to them that every protection in a legal system is only as durable as the willingness of those with power to honor it. I saw judicial systems being reshaped, not through scandal, not through obvious corruption that could be pointed to and condemned, through retirement, through carefully timed vacancies, through the patient, generational project of replacing one judicial philosophy with another until the institution that was designed to be a check on power had become an instrument of it. And I saw the press, not destroyed because destroying it would have been too visible, too obviously authoritarian, too easy to resist. I saw it being purchased. I saw it being consolidated. I saw it being made economically dependent on the same interests it was supposed to scrutinize until the scrutiny became theater, until the appearance of a free press was maintained while the function of one was quietly dismantled. I saw financial systems being restructured, new frameworks presented as modernization, as efficiency, as security, as progress. Each new framework requiring the small surrender of individual autonomy in exchange for a large gain in convenience. And people accepted each exchange willingly because each one seemed reasonable in isolation. It was only in the vision, seeing all the exchanges together, that I understood what was being built. It was a cage, assembled piece by piece, presented as a gift at each stage, and nearly complete before most people registered that they were inside it. And then the Spirit spoke, and what he said changed the entire orientation of my understanding. He said, "The nation is not being taken, it has already been taken. What you are watching now is the announcement." I sat with that for a long time in the vision, because it changes everything about how we assess the situation we are in. We have been debating, arguing, praying about whether the takeover is coming, whether the prophecies about the end of national sovereignty and the rise of centralized control are future events or present ones. And the vision showed me with complete clarity, the debate is the distraction. The structure was put in place while we debated whether the structure existed. The foundation was poured while we argued about the blueprint. What is happening now is not construction, it is occupation. It is the new occupant, rearranging the furniture and changing the locks on a building that looks from the outside exactly the same as it always did. I saw the great institutions of democratic governance, courts, regulatory bodies, central banks, intelligence agencies, the organs of a free press, not being destroyed, being repurposed. Like a historic building that has been gutted and refurnished for a new tenant, while the original facade is maintained for the sake of appearances. The name on the door is the same. The plaque has not been changed, but what happens inside those walls now has nothing to do with what the building was designed for. And because the outside looks familiar, most people walk past it every day and feel a comfort that the interior no longer justifies. I understood in that moment why God had not answered my prayer to simply tell me if things were going to be all right. Because the answer to that prayer depends entirely on who you are, where you stand, and what you are willing to hold on to when the holding becomes costly. For those inside the will of God, things will be more than all right, but not in the way we typically use that phrase, not in the sense of comfort and ease and undisturbed prosperity. All right in the way that a soldier is all right when he is in the right position, with the right orders, with the right commanding officer, even when the battle around him is at its most ferocious, standing, not comfortable, but standing. The second movement of the vision arrived without pause, without transition, the way one wave follows another, before the first one has fully receded. I was still processing what I had seen when the scene shifted, and I found myself looking at something that I have spent the past 3 weeks searching for language to describe accurately. I saw a system. I want to be careful here, because I have spent 40 years listening to prophecy teachers describe the mark of the beast in terms that were shaped by the technology available at the time. Those descriptions were formed: microchips, barcodes, implants, the imagery of science fiction dressed in eschatological language. What I saw in the vision was none of those things, or rather, it was all of those things and far beyond them, assembled into something so sophisticated and so layered that to reduce it to any single object or technology would be to miss the point entirely and leave people watching for the wrong thing. What I saw was an architecture of compliance, built in layers, each layer introduced separately over time, each layer designed to be accepted before the next one was revealed. Each layer presented as a solution to a genuine problem so that resistance to it would seem not only unreasonable but cruel. I saw the first layer, and it was financial, a digital currency, not cryptocurrency in the existing sense, but a centrally controlled digital monetary system that replaced physical money. It was presented as the solution to inflation, to financial crime, to poverty, to inequality. It was presented as the democratization of access to economic life. And the people who were most economically vulnerable, the people who had suffered most under the existing financial system, were the first to embrace it, because it offered them something immediate and real: relief, access, inclusion, things they had been denied for generations. And I do not judge them for accepting it. I understand it. And that is precisely why it was designed the way it was designed. But within the architecture of this digital financial system was a mechanism I saw clearly in the vision: a compliance layer. A set of behavioral conditions attached to the ability to transact, not stated openly at first, embedded in the terms of service that no one reads, appearing first as small inconveniences for those who violated certain behavioral guidelines, slower transactions, temporary holds, flags on accounts. Then as larger consequences, then eventually as access denial. I saw a woman at a point of sale, a grocery store, an ordinary grocery store, with ordinary food on the shelves. And when she pressed her hand or her device to the reader, the screen returned a denial. Not insufficient funds, compliance threshold not met, and she knew what it meant. 3 days before, she had posted something publicly about her faith, about Jesus Christ specifically, about the exclusivity of salvation through him alone. And the system had noted it, had scored it, had found her wanting by its metrics. And her children stood beside her in that grocery store, and I saw the look on her face, and it was the look I have seen on the faces of people who have just understood, for the first time in a way that is no longer theoretical, what it means to lose everything. The second layer was identity. I saw a unified profile system, something that merged health data, financial history, social behavior, location patterns, and religious affiliation into a single living record attached to every person. It was not hidden. People were encouraged to maintain it, to update it, to display it. It became, in the culture I was seeing, a form of status. A high compliance score opened doors, literally and figuratively. Early access to housing, priority in medical care, freedom of movement that lower-scoring individuals did not enjoy. And because the rewards for compliance were real and immediate, and because the penalties for non-compliance were applied gradually rather than all at once, the majority of people moved through the transition without ever experiencing a moment that felt like a decisive choice. It was 1,000 small choices that added up to one enormous one. And by the time you could see the shape of the whole, Most people were already inside it. The third layer was the one that made me grip the edge of my desk in the vision until my knuckles whitened. It was a mark. I will not speculate on its precise physical form because in the vision I perceived its effect and its meaning far more clearly than its specific form. And I believe God withheld the specificity on purpose, because the moment I name a particular technology or format, people will watch for that thing and miss the reality of what is already being assembled around them. What I know about the mark is this: those who received it experienced an immediate and genuine relief. The pressure that had been building, the anxiety of living under constant behavioral scrutiny, the exhaustion of trying to maintain access to basic resources in a system that demanded compliance, it lifted. They could move freely. They could transact without restriction. They could eat, work, travel, participate in the life of the society they lived in. And many of them wept with gratitude. They called it liberation. They called it the end of uncertainty. They called it, in some of the language I heard in the vision, a blessing. And I understood, watching them celebrate, that this was the most heartbreaking part of everything I was being shown. Because the relief was real, the access was real, the removal of the pressure was real. What they could not perceive, what had been deliberately designed to be imperceptible at the moment of acceptance, was what they had surrendered in exchange. Not a fingerprint, not a number, not biometric data. What they surrendered was the architecture of refusal, the structural capacity to say no. Once inside the system at its deepest level, the question of compliance was no longer a question. The choice had already been made and made permanently, and what remained was only the experience of living within it. But I also saw those who refused, and I want to be truthful about what I saw, because I think the church has sometimes painted the picture of the faithful remnant in ways that are romantically dishonest. Those who refused were not prosperous. They were not comfortable. They lived on the margins of a system that had been specifically designed to make margin living unsustainable. They experienced genuine hardship, real hunger, real cold, real exclusion. There was nothing glamorous about their resistance, and yet, and I want you to hear this with everything you have, they carried something in their faces and in their spirits that those who had accepted the mark had visibly lost, something I recognized from the field. From soldiers who had been surrounded and were running low on everything and knew it, and had chosen to hold the line anyway because they knew the cost of retreating was greater than the cost of holding. There was a clarity in them, a dignity that scarcity could not remove, and the Spirit told me that they were being sustained by means the system could not track, could not deny, and could not understand, not lavishly, not in ways that made their situation externally comfortable, but sustained, fed, held, by a hand the system had no record of. The mark is not a future event being planned in some shadowy boardroom. It is a present architecture being normalized, one layer at a time, one convenience at a time, one small surrender at a time, and by the time most people name what it is, they will already be inside it. The Spirit spoke again in the middle of that second movement, and what he said was this: the mark is not a future event being planned. It is a present architecture being normalized, one layer at a time, one convenience at a time, one surrender at a time. And when he said that, everything I had been observing in the world around me for the past 2 years rearranged itself in my understanding like a mosaic that had been lying in fragments on the floor, suddenly assembling into the image it had always been. I thought of the digital payment systems, the social credit frameworks being tested in various nations, the increasing integration of behavioral data into financial services, the slow erosion of cash as a medium of exchange, the normalization of biometric data collection, the merging of health records with identity systems. None of these things, presented in isolation, looks like what the Book of Revelation describes. Together, in the vision, they formed exactly that picture, not the cartoon version we were handed, the real one, the sophisticated one, the one designed by people who had read the prophecy and decided to make it look like something else. Then the third movement arrived, and I have hesitated the longest over this portion because I know how it sounds. I know the history of people who have pointed at public figures and assigned them the role of the Antichrist. And I know how that history has gone. The embarrassment, the retraction, the discrediting of prophecy as a discipline, the damage done to the credibility of the church each time a name was named with certainty and turned out to be wrong. I am not going to name a name. What I am going to describe is what I saw, and I am going to trust the Holy Spirit to do what only he can do, to take the description and press it into the heart of whoever needs to understand it in their specific context. I saw a man. He was standing on a platform that was not one nation's stage, but many nations' stage simultaneously, something assembled by international consensus, by the agreement of governments and institutions and financial bodies and religious organizations that had all decided, for their own reasons, that this figure was the answer to the crisis they were all experiencing. He was not physically remarkable. That surprised me. I had always imagined that a figure of this kind of global significance would be visually imposing, commanding in some obvious way. He was not. He was the kind of man you might pass in a hallway and not notice. But when he spoke, and I watched him speak in the vision, something happened in the environment around him that I can only describe as a field of influence that was invisible but absolutely real. People leaned toward him when he talked. People felt in his proximity that they had finally been understood, that someone had finally arrived who saw the full complexity of what they were suffering, who recognized them, who intended to repair what had been broken not through ideology or force but through a kind of wisdom that felt ancient and personal at the same time. He spoke about peace, he spoke about unity, he spoke about the failure of old systems, political systems, religious systems, economic systems, with a fluency and a fairness that made it impossible to find the lie in any individual sentence. He was not wrong about the failures were real and his diagnosis of them was accurate. That was the most dangerous thing about him. He was not wrong, he was incomplete. He carried truth the way a forger carries a genuine signature, reproduced with perfect technical accuracy but missing the one thing that makes a signature real, which is the living hand that produced it. He spoke about God, carefully, inclusively, in the language of many traditions simultaneously, in a way that offended no one and therefore committed to nothing. He quoted scripture. I heard the words in the vision and I recognized them. Genuine words, genuine verses, quoted with a facility that suggested long familiarity. But something in me recoiled with each quotation the way a body recoils from something that looks like food but carries within it something that will cause harm, because I know what the word of God feels like when it is alive, when it is spoken by someone in whom the Spirit of God is present, and the Spirit of God is present in the words as they are delivered. And what I heard from this man was the form of the word without the life of it, the shell, the technical reproduction, the sound without the breath, and the people received him. I watched it happen in waves, and I watched the waves and recognized them because I have seen the same sequence in military contexts, in the dynamics of how populations receive leaders in times of crisis. First, the exhausted people came, the people who had been carrying unbearable weight for too long and needed someone to take the weight from them, who would have given almost anything to someone who simply said, "I see you, I know, I will fix this." They came first. Then the hopeful came, the idealists, the people who had been waiting for the kind of leader who could rise above division and speak to the whole of humanity rather than a fragment of it. They came next. Then the desperate came, people whose material circumstances had deteriorated to the point where philosophical objections to the man's agenda were a luxury they could not afford. Their children needed to eat, and this man controlled, or was aligned with those who controlled, the systems that determined whether children ate. So the desperate came, and I do not judge any of these groups. I understand them. I have ministered to all of them in various forms. I know what drives each wave and why. But then came the wave that broke something in my chest as I watched it in the vision. Then came the church, or what remained of the church that had spent the preceding decades trading its prophetic voice for cultural acceptance, its distinctiveness for relevance, its willingness to say hard things for the approval of people who would only stay if nothing hard was said. I saw church buildings, large ones, well-known ones, the kind with names you would recognize and attendance figures that appear in newspaper articles about the health of American Christianity. I saw their stages, I saw their lights, I saw their carefully produced worship experiences, and I saw their leaders standing beside this man, sharing his platform, lending him the accumulated spiritual authority of generations of genuine ministry that they themselves had not built but had inherited, and were now spending in a single transaction. I heard the language they used, the language of blessing, of endorsement, of divine appointment. I heard denominations issue formal statements of theological justification for their support. I saw the machinery of organized Christianity being retooled in real time, its infrastructure and its credibility, and its access to millions of trusting people being redirected toward a purpose that had nothing to do with the kingdom of God, and the people in the pews followed, because they trusted their pastors, because they had been taught to trust their pastors, because the whole apparatus of ecclesial authority had trained them to receive from the front of the room rather than to test from within their own spirits what was being delivered. And so when the man from the front of the room said that this global figure was a gift from God, they believed it, because the man at the front of the room had never lied to them before, or at least they believed he had never lied to them. What they did not know was that the man at the front of the room had not been lying intentionally. He had simply been wrong. He had lost the ability to discern over years of prioritizing the wrong things, and he no longer knew that he had lost it. He spoke with the same confidence he had always spoken with. He used the same vocabulary. He employed the same emotional register. But the antenna was broken, and he did not know the signal he was receiving was not the one he believed it to be. I cried in the vision, "I am not a man who cries easily, ask anyone who served with me." But I cried watching that, because I understood that the greatest casualty of what was happening was not freedom, was not sovereignty, was not even physical safety. The greatest casualty was trust, the trust of ordinary people who had given their spiritual lives into the keeping of shepherds who were no longer able to guard them. The sheep did not know they were unguarded because the shepherd was still there, still speaking, still performing the functions of a shepherd, still occupying the position. But the spirit that makes a shepherd was no longer present in the same way. Something had quietly departed, and the departure had been so gradual, so undramatic, so unannounced, that neither the shepherd nor the sheep had noticed the moment it happened. The spirit spoke to me one final time in the vision, not with elaboration, not with a long explanation, with a single sentence, clear and surgical and devastating in its simplicity. He said, "My people will know him, not by what he says, but by what they feel when they are near me." I sat with that sentence in the vision and I understood what it meant. The protection against deception at the level I was being shown is not intellectual. It is not theological sophistication. It is not the ability to identify logical inconsistencies in a false prophet's argument, or to catalogue the ways his doctrine deviates from orthodox Christianity. All of those things are useful, but none of them are sufficient, because the man I saw in the vision was sophisticated enough to pass those tests, or at least to pass them closely enough that the gap was deniable. The protection is intimacy. Intimacy with God so deep and so practiced and so consistent that when something presents itself that is not God, the dissonance is felt before it is reasoned, the way a mother knows the cry of her child in a room full of crying children, not because she has analyzed the acoustic signature, but because she knows that voice, has known it from the first moment, and carries it inside her in a place that is beyond analysis. When I came back to full awareness, it was past 4 in the morning. I was still in the chair. My hands were flat on the desk. My Bible was open to the book of Revelation, but I had not put it there deliberately. It was where the pages had fallen when I sat down. I sat until the sun came up over the eastern part of the city. I did not sleep. I wrote every detail I could access in my journal, the precise details, the sequencing, the language of what the Spirit had spoken, because I am a precise man by training and I do not trust memory when documentation is possible. What you are reading now is drawn directly from those notes. I have not dramatized, I have not embellished. I have, if anything, understated, because there are elements of what I saw that I do not yet have language for, and I refuse to fill the language gap with invention. The days that followed, I could not sleep normally. I prayed more than I have prayed since the worst days of my second deployment. I fasted beyond the original 21 days by an additional week, because I needed to be certain as a human being can be about these things, that what I had experienced was genuine and not the fever dream of an exhausted man who had been asking too many questions for too long. And in that extended time of prayer and fasting, the vision did not diminish. The details did not soften or blur the way dreams do when you try to hold them. They became, if anything, sharper, more insistent, and the internal pressure to speak, to bring this out of the private journal in the public record, became something I could no longer manage by simply continuing to pray about it. It felt in my spirit, the way it feels when you have intelligence that will cost lives if withheld, and a chaplain who has been in combat knows that feeling and knows what it demands of you. So I am telling you now. I am telling you without the cushioning of diplomatic pastoral language, without the softening qualifications I might normally use when delivering difficult content to people. I do not want to frighten unnecessarily, because I believe the moment for unnecessary caution has passed. I believe we are in a season where the kindest thing a watchman can do is be accurate, even when accuracy is alarming. The nation has already been taken. I am not speaking of a specific election or a specific administration or a specific political party. I am speaking of something that runs beneath all of those surface expressions of power and has been running for longer than most people's political memory extends. The taking was not a single event, it was a process, and the process is complete enough now that what is happening in plain view is not the takeover itself, but the implementation of what the takeover has made possible. The cage is not being built, the cage is built. What we are watching now are the doors being closed one by one, in ways that still look like policy, still look like governance, and still look like the ordinary operations of a functioning democracy, because the people closing the doors have studied what happened when doors were closed too quickly and too obviously in other nations and other centuries, and they have decided to be patient, to be gradual, to be legal. The mark is not coming. The architecture of the mark is already here. It is already normalized. It is already in your pocket, already on your wrist, already in the terms and conditions you agreed to without reading, already in the behavioral data that has been collected about you for years and stored in systems you have never seen and will never be permitted to audit. The final layer, the layer that makes it irreversible, is being prepared, but the preparation is almost complete, and most people will not recognize the moment of completion because it will not look like a moment. It will look like an upgrade. It will look like an improvement to a system they already use. It will be presented as a benefit, and the primary sensation it will produce in the people who accept it will be relief, genuine, immediate, real relief from a pressure that will have been carefully calibrated to make the acceptance feel like the only reasonable response. And the man is here. I will not name him. I will not speculate publicly about his identity, because I did not see his face with the clarity that would justify a name, and because I know the history of what happens when names are named incorrectly in prophetic contexts. But I will tell you what to watch for. Watch for a man who speaks to the whole of humanity rather than a portion of it, who diagnoses the failures of existing systems with an accuracy that is difficult to dispute, who includes God in his language while committing to nothing specific about God's authority over human life, who produces, in the people around him, an emotional response that feels like recognition, like finally being understood, like finally being seen, that is disproportionate to anything he has actually said or done. Watch for the church endorsing him. Watch for the language of divine appointment being applied to him by men and women who should know better, and who, at an earlier point in their ministries, would have known better. Watch for the convergence of political authority, financial control, and religious credibility in a single figure, or in a coalition so tightly aligned that it functions as a single figure. When you see that convergence, test it, not with your analysis, with your spirit, with the part of you that knows God's presence and can recognize his absence. Because the test that will matter in that moment is not intellectual and it is not theological. It is intimate. It is the test of a child who knows their father's voice in the dark. What do I ask of you? I am not going to give you a checklist. I am not going to tell you to stockpile resources or move to a rural compound or prepare for a specific set of physical circumstances. Those things may or may not be relevant depending on your situation, and God can direct you about the practical details of your specific life better than I can from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. What I am going to give you is what the Spirit gave me, not a plan but a posture, a way of standing in this season that will hold when the wind comes. Learn the voice of God now, not as a theological proposition, as a daily practice. Open the Word every morning, not for information but for contact, for the experience of being in the presence of the one who wrote it. Pray not as a religious obligation but as a conversation between people who know each other, who have history together, who can tell by the quality of the silence what the other is feeling. Fast regularly, not as punishment, not as a spiritual performance to impress anyone, but as the practice of choosing the spirit over the flesh in a controlled environment, so that when the choice is forced upon you in an environment you did not choose, and the stakes are not abstract, you have already made that choice 10,000 times, and your spirit knows the way. The person who has never fasted by choice will have great difficulty fasting by necessity. The person who has practiced saying no to their own comfort in private will find when comfort is taken from them publicly that they still know how to stand. Guard your home as a spiritual environment. I do not mean this sentimentally or decoratively. I mean it strategically. What you allow to form your understanding of reality shapes your ability to discern what is real. The architecture of the system I saw in the vision runs directly through the device of platforms that most of us interact with for multiple hours every day. Those platforms are not neutral. They have been designed. And I am speaking now as someone who understands what it means to design a behavioral environment, because the army designs behavioral environments, and I was trained to understand them. They have been designed to shape perception, to normalize certain realities and make others invisible, to produce emotional states that make certain conclusions feel obvious and others feel extreme. Be aware of that. Be intentional about what you permit to shape your perception of the world, and fill the space that you create with the Word of God, with prayer, with the testimony of what God has done in your own life and in the lives of people you trust. Build community, not online community, though that has its place, real community. People who sit in rooms together, who eat at the same tables, who know each other's children's names and each other's struggles and each other's specific vulnerabilities to particular temptations. The isolated believer is the vulnerable one. The system I saw in the vision was designed, among other things, to produce isolation, to make people feel that their concerns were unique to them, that no one else shared their doubts or their resistance, that they were alone in what they felt. The antidote to that is visible, embodied community. People who can look each other in the eyes and say, I see you, I am here, you are not crazy, you are not alone. Build that out now before the pressure that makes it necessary has arrived, because building it under pressure is much harder than building it in comparative peace. And to my fellow pastors, to every shepherd reading this who carries responsibility for souls, I speak now as directly as I know how. The man I saw in the vision will come for the church first, not to destroy it from the outside. To use it from within, he needs the credibility of spiritual language. He needs the infrastructure of organized faith. The buildings, the mailing lists, the donor bases, the media relationships, the cultural authority that generations of faithful ministry have deposited into the account of the church's reputation. He will not ask for it openly. He will create conditions under which offering it feels like wisdom, like maturity, like the responsible exercise of institutional influence. And the only thing that will enable a pastor to recognize what is happening in that moment and refuse it is the same thing the Spirit named as the protection for every believer, an intimate knowledge of God's voice, not theological training, not institutional affiliation, not the size of the congregation or the length of the ministry. Intimacy, the daily, costly, private, unglamorous practice of actually being with God in a way that keeps his voice distinct and recognizable even when surrounded by very convincing counterfeits. Examine yourself now, not in a spirit of condemnation. God is not asking you to condemn yourself. In a spirit of honest assessment, kneel before him alone with no one watching, with no performance to maintain, with no reputation to protect, and ask, is your presence still here? Is your voice still distinct to me? Do I still fear you more than I fear the loss of what I have built? If the answer to any of those questions requires more than a moment's reflection, deal with that now, before the platform matters, before the man arrives who will make compromise feel like wisdom and silence feel like grace. The cost of addressing it now is discomfort. The cost of leaving it unaddressed is far greater than I want to describe in this document. I have been in places where everything depended on the next decision, where the wrong choice at the wrong moment meant that people under my care did not survive. I know what it is to feel the weight of responsibility for souls in dangerous territory. I carry that weight now in a different form, not in a combat zone but in a church building with unreliable heating on the east side of Harrisburg. But the weight is the same. And the urgency I feel is the same urgency I felt when the intelligence was real and the window for acting on it was closing. This is that kind of moment. The nation has already been taken. The mark is being normalized. The man is in the world. These are not future events I am warning you about. These are present realities I am asking you to see clearly, to stop waiting for the dramatic forms we were told to expect, and to recognize them in the undramatic, bureaucratic, incremental, convenience-wrapped forms in which they have actually arrived. God is not surprised by any of this. I want to close with that because I think it is the most important thing I can offer after everything else I have said. The vision was alarming. What I saw was genuinely, soberly alarming, and I will not minimize that. But throughout the entire vision, through the governmental seizure and the compliance architecture, and the false figure on the global stage, the Spirit of God was not panicking. He was not absent. He was not wringing his hands. He was present, and he was sovereign, and he was actively gathering his people, the way a shepherd gathers the flock before a storm, not to prevent the storm from coming, because the storm is coming, but to ensure that none of the sheep face it alone. He is gathering now. And if you are reading this, I believe it is not by accident. I believe the same Spirit who woke me up at 2 in the morning and showed me what he showed me is the Spirit who brought this text to your attention at whatever hour you are reading it, in whatever city or country or circumstance you find yourself in. And he is asking you the same question. He asked me when the vision ended, and I sat alone at my desk in the dark with the sun beginning to come up over the city. Now that you have seen, what will you do? I know what I am doing. I am standing. I am praying with my congregation every week with more urgency than I have prayed in 11 years of pastoring. I am teaching them to know God's voice and not just God's language. I am removing from my own life and ministry everything that would compromise my ability to discern clearly in the moment when discernment costs something. I am refusing to be among the pastors I saw in the vision, the ones on the stage, endorsing what they should have opposed, because they had spent too long in environments that rewarded comfort and penalized clarity. I am a man who drove into military convoys through territory where the road ahead could end without warning. I know what it means to stay alert when alertness is exhausting. I know what it means to hold a position when holding it is costly. And I know what it means to trust a commanding officer who can see the whole battlefield when you can only see the few meters in front of you. God can see the whole battlefield. He always could, and he always will. And he is not telling us to fight this battle in our own strength or with our own wisdom or through our own political or institutional strategies. He is telling us to stay close, to know his voice, to keep our homes clean and our spirits awake and our hands open and our knees willing to bend. Because what is coming will not ask if we are ready. It is already here. And the only question that remains, the only question that has ever remained in every generation that has faced a moment of this kind, is whether the people of God will be found, when it matters most, standing in his presence, holding his word, and willing to lose everything this world offers in order to keep the one thing it cannot take. I pray that you will be, I pray that I will be, and I am asking God, from this warehouse on the east side of Harrisburg, with the heat that works only when it wants to, wait, and the 90 ordinary people who trust me with their souls, I am asking him to mark every home that reads these words with the seal of the Holy Spirit, to be the protection that no system can override and no compliance score can remove. He is able, he has always been able, and he has not changed. Stand up, clean your house, know his voice, and do not wait for the visible sign to move, because the sign has already come. Quieter than we expected, closer than we were told, and already further along than most of us are willing to believe. God is warning, I am delivering that warning. What you do with it is between you and him. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, not as a phrase, as a decision, as a seal, as the only answer that will matter when everything else is being decided for us.